English grammar, Latin prevalence, and you interest us? Wait, you ought to speak by it as influenced. If you don't speak Yoda that well, I just asked if the prevalence of Latin in English grammar interests you. Star Wars fans may be interested to know that the normal way Yoda speaks basically follows the typical Latin word order. And many of you may already know that many English words come from Latin, but the Latin language influences our language more than you probably realize. And in fact, because it's such a big part of English, it's probably good you know some of the connection between Latin and English. If you understand your own language better, then you can communicate better. And if that doesn't interest you, well, at least you have something really impressive to talk about at your next dinner party. So, I've taken about 4 years of Latin. I have some good insight on the language and how it affects our language and culture. English truly is the daughter language of Latin. Our native tongue resembles it in so many more ways than you probably realize. Today I want to cover the similarities between the two languages in terms of vocabulary, grammar, and literature and culture. English is a conglomeration of several languages, but Latin's at the heart, and the easiest way to see that influence is in our words and our terms and phrases. Many of our words and phrases are actually Latin derivatives, and by derivative I just mean that it comes from a Latin word. In fact, according to Ecce Romani, which is a really popular and acclaimed Latin textbook series, over 66% of the words in English language come from Latin. So Latin affects our English words in multiple ways. For one thing, we have the same alphabet. There are maybe 3 or 4 letters that are different, and the letters even look really similar. So you may not be able to read much Latin, but you could probably have some clue as how to pronounce it. And even beyond that, many Latin roots and prefixes and suffixes come into English, such as the prefix sub, which means under. We also have some smaller terms and phrases we use every day that come from Latin. The most common is probably etc, or etc, or as the Romans said, et cetera, which just means and the rest. Also, as I said before, many of our words are Latin derivatives, and my favorite example is defenestrate, which comes from the Latin word de, meaning away from, and the other Latin word fenestra, meaning window. So when you put it together in English, it means to throw out a window. So if you're ever angry at someone, tell them they should be nicer to you, or you'll defenestrate them. If they know what you mean, they might actually shut up. But Latin isn't just in our words, it's also in the basis of our grammar. According to Lynn Muggleston, a prominent local Latin teacher, English and language grammar are so similar that they even used to be taught together, and usually at about the same time in your education. In fact, learning Latin improves your English grammar. There are also some similarities in the way they use nouns and pronouns. For one thing, they have similar functions within the sentences, and they can be, for example, a subject or an object, but they also change the words to be more specific. And by that, I just mean something like, you can say, I have a box, or I have many boxes. We add the es ending onto box in order to say that it's plural. But there are also some similarities in verbs. They change too, and they normally change to show things like tenses. And by tense, I just mean the approximate time when the action takes place. So we have the current or the present tense, and we have the future tense, something that'll take place in the future. So, and an example of that is just, I run right now, or yesterday I ran. But if you're not a grammarian, you may be interested to know how Latin affects you in more interesting ways. For example, Latin affects our language through literature and culture. After all, language, literature, and culture have always been really closely tied. So, you may or may not know, depending on if you're Catholic or know many Catholics, but Latin's really big in the church, at least that church. In fact, there's even a form of Latin called Church Latin, which is mostly the same as ancient Latin, but it's pronounced a little differently, and some of the forms are different. In fact, one of the Bible's original languages was Latin, and Latin's still present in a lot of church Latin terms and in songs. But Latin also comes through in literature, and this might be more applicable to more of you. One of the biggest examples is Shakespeare. Not only did he use straight Latin words in his works, but he also made up English words based on Latin words. And he also liked to use a lot of Roman mythology. And speaking of that, J.K. Rowling, the author of the popular Harry Potter series, also uses a lot of Roman mythology. And when she's not using that, she's making up spells, and, you guessed it, her spells are Latin-based. And if you don't care about that, at least you should know it's important to legal terminology today. For example, the most common example is amicus curiae, meaning friend of the court. And beyond that, we also have what we call dicta, which means expressions or sayings. And one of the more common sayings in English is amor omnia vincit, or in English, love conquers all. So there are scores of other examples I could be giving you, but as another Latin expression goes, tempus fugit, time flies, and I'd probably better wrap this up. Hopefully you've got a better understanding of the parallels between Latin and English and the way that Latin affects English through grammar, vocabulary, and culture. So remember, in the words of Robert Fitzgerald, English will inevitably make use of the Latin element in our language. Thank you.
Won't end. You kidding me right now?